real pleasure on behalf of the Chicago Ideas community to have you join us. So before I introduce you, I just want to welcome you. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much, Brad. I'm just grateful to have a chance to speak to you. It's always a pleasure to be with you in the Chicago Ideas community. Thank you.
So you have been a part of this community, I think, since the earliest days, about more than a decade ago. And what's so interesting to me is where you are now, the Poetry Foundation. And that's what brings us to the topic today, which is, how does poetry show up as we think about the big questions of life? Before we get there, a little bit of professional background. You have had roles including the Commissioner of Cultural Affairs at the City of Chicago, so many roles in the cultural institutions that make up our great city. I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about that career path and what you knew about yourself along the way, that sort of before we get to the Poetry Foundation, some of the highlights of that career path and what it told you about yourself.
Well, it's interesting, as you said, being a part of the Chicago Ideas community right from the beginning. I feel like I've had maybe 25 jobs over the course of that time. So my professional career actually began more in entertainment. I worked for a long time in television. I was, in the record industry, a little short stint in film, but eventually found my way to nonprofit arts. And part of that was driven by, one, all my life, I've always been attracted to the creative sector. And so even though I was in entertainment, it was still an environment that placed me around creatives. I just loved it. I loved being around people who had the talent that I didn't have. And I wanted to find a way to earn my living supporting that kind of work. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to do that. But along the way, it wasn't just enough to be around creative people. I wanted to feel like my work made a difference, that through the arts, through the creative inspiration that I was around, that I was really involved in kind of touching lives, changing lives with the arts.
And what's your take on the business model of arts? Because the arts are uniquely, in large part, unsustainable without some augmentation of income or capital. Do you agree with that? And because I say that because I think that the role of cities, of nonprofits and foundations, and of like the charitable acts of giving are part of what sustains the arts, but that without the arts, we don't have a society with depth. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the model is constantly changing. You can go all the way back to the Renaissance period where you had patrons who commissioned artists and supported the arts. I think, the pandemic is certainly going to change a lot of the models that we've existed on in the past, morphing into something that might be totally new. In Europe, the government is the primary supporter for the arts sector. But we're finding now, as governments are being more challenged financially, Europe is actually looking to the model in the United States of philanthropic support for the arts and the nonprofit model in a way that they really didn't have to before in the past. And I think here in the United States, the nonprofit art sector is looking more to the commercial arts for ideas, for sustainability, sustainable models, more of a business model, bringing a more of a level of professionalism, so that they recognize we can't sustain the work on a purely philanthropic model. It has to be kind of a combination. You need support from multiple areas, from the government, from individuals, from the philanthropic community, and earned revenue. And I think also the business side is also looking how to learn from the nonprofit sector for when everything got shut down. and your earned revenue was totally cut off, what do you do? So I think everybody is kind of looking at best practices across all kinds of lines and divisions, and trying to learn and mine from each other to see how we can continue with the work.
It seems to me that the redefinition of what is art, let's say, or what is artistic engagement or a great artistic city or society, that question is just starting to be asked. Like the what is business? The answer in large part has been at least written, hasn't been executed yet. But around technology is at the sort of foundation of go forward in business. But in arts, in person and engagement, one to one, one to many. I
But
just
I
think
think we find, the same tools that businesses, you mentioned technology. Like technology has played a huge part over the last 2 years in the arts. If it wasn't for technology, many of the performing arts institutions that we've known and loved for decades wouldn't have made it. It
yeah,
was because they were able to extend their work through virtual platforms and the use of technology to keep their audiences engaged, to keep their staffs employed, quite frankly, keep the artists alive. Artists have to create, artists have to perform.
yeah.
And it offered opportunities for them to find these new, quote unquote, stages to present their work. What's happening in the visual art world with NFTs, this is kind of amazing, the use of technology with visual art. So I think, it's constantly changing. What is art? That question evolves and changes, from day to day, and depends on who you ask.
And the fun part is that question was asked back in the Renaissance times and probably, centuries before. Before we go to poetry, last question. Is there a city, the engagement you've had at so many, in so many aspects of Chicago, the civic life of Chicago and cultural life of Chicago has such depth. If you look at cities other than Chicago, what one city would you say has really found a way to make art and artistic engagement vital and functional at its core?
Well, I mean, I've traveled a lot and I've been to a lot of cities, and I think what's happening in Chicago is actually pretty unique, especially at the government level. There is no other city in this country, at least, that is responsible for producing and presenting the level of free art engagement that happens here in Chicago. The Chicago Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events is unrivaled with any other city art agency in terms of the amount of free experiences that they offer. Most city agencies are set up to be re-granting organizations, that the funding that's available to those agencies gets redistributed back out directly to arts organizations and grants. And I think it goes back to, the visionary Lois Weisberg, who was a legendary commissioner for cultural affairs in Chicago, who, really latched onto this idea that citizens have to feel good about their city. And you feel good about your city because you have things to do that you enjoy. And you want to share those experiences with your family and your friends, and you invite them to come and visit you, to be a part of it. You think about in the summer, you could throw a dart at the wall and there's going to be some kind of music festival, some kind of art fair, free summer dance. There's something going on, and it happens in every neighborhood across the city.
And if someone was studying Chicago,
it's really unique.
If somebody's studying our city, other than our city devoting money to it, what's one thing that we've done as a city that has resulted in the product of a vibrant, engaged city the way that we have created?
Well, I think the innovation that's happened here in the arts, we've had more storefront theaters, which has been an incubator for plays, playwrights, performers on stage, house music, the blues, gospel music, to some degree, jazz, when Louis Armstrong came here from New Orleans. These are musical styles. These are creative movements the Black Arts Movement in the 70s. These are things that really happened right here. And I think it's because of the makeup of the city.
Yeah.
We've been a hub for immigration, migration. And so you have this convergence of cultures all coming together, in this one space, working together, vibing off of each other, expressing each other's cultures, and each one kind of stealing a little bit from the other to make something new. I think that's really cool.
They talk about jazz has always been not just a form of music. It's an analogy or a mythology, I think, or it presents a mythology for a great life, in my opinion, because jazz is about engaging, interacting, trying new tidbits, riffing with each other, and ultimately flowing, trying to find flow. And it's interesting when you talk about the innovation or the sort of acceptance or enablement of lots of experiments in Chicago as part of the formula. And I wonder, for another day, we could talk about, it'd be fun to talk about, like, if another city was studying Chicago and trying to do something uniquely excellent themselves to break out of their mold, how a city with less diversity, let's say, or less riffing could add more riffing, add more experimentation, innovation to its cultural life. I don't know, but
I just want, even when you mentioned about, like, jazz and the whole improv thing, I wonder if there could be a correlation between what happened or what has been the impetus for creation of jazz, how that then maybe inspired what happened here with comedy and the whole improv movement, riffing off of each other on stage for a laugh. Is that any different from riffing with each other musically on stage? So I think all of these things, may seem very separate, but we have managed to learn from one and apply it to different genres in the arts.
Which beautifully, let's use that as a beautiful bridge towards poetry. To me, poetry is a person who puts something that is both words and beyond words on paper, or spoken word, and the riff is that to the reader's soul, way beyond the reader's mind. And I'm curious how you were drawn to the Poetry Foundation to start the conversation about how poetry shows up these days.
Yeah, well, I mean, poetry is also another genre that's really a part of Chicago's DNA. Slam poetry really incubated here. And again, back to kind of the Black Arts Movement of the 70s, I grew up listening to local lyricists and songwriter Oscar Brown Jr., who, quite frankly, was a poet at heart. One of the first 45s I bought was a song by him. And I'm like, a little 9-year-old kid going to the record store to buy Oscar Brown Jr., of all things. But, you used to hear this on the radio. It was in the community. It was in the neighborhood. Like, you grow up listening to the Last Poets, Gil Scott-Heron, Nikki Giovanni. Like, poetry used to have a place, a prominence culturally throughout the essence of the city. And so for me, when I think about the Poetry Foundation, it's almost like a homecoming. I had to go kind of full circle through the arts before I landed back here. And I'm really grateful and thankful that that was the case. I wouldn't say it was so much about me finding the Poetry Foundation as they really found me. And it might have been like this invisible pull bringing me back, to my origins with the arts, with creativity from when I was a kid.
And well, I guess a pun very much intended, but it's a poetic story. You grew up in Chicago, is that right?
I was born here in Chicago, and then when I was about 11, my family moved to Gary, Indiana, which is basically a far south suburb to the city. Yeah. But I've been in Chicago pretty much all my adult life.
And poetry. When did you first hear about the Poetry Foundation? Because for me, I heard about it when they received the huge grant, which must have been 20 years ago. Is that right?
Yeah, about 20 years ago. I actually used to subscribe to Poetry Magazine when I was in college. And so I used to imagine one day that I didn't think of myself as being a closet poet, but I was very interested in playwriting. And I liked the structure of poetry because it was important for me to find a way to use words um, orally. And so poetry, while many poems are meant to be read, it's also the rhythm and the cadence of the words, the rhyme, the syntax. You know, how do you bring music to the spoken word was what I was kind of looking for, what I had imagined. If I was to write plays, I wanted it to sound like it was poetry on stage. And so I was an early subscriber to Poetry Magazine. And at that time, the foundation didn't exist. And like everybody else, yeah, I learned about the foundation after the really transformative gift from Ruth Lilly back 20 years ago.
And take us to the purpose of the foundation post receipt of that gift, how it launched into the world with such a strong endowed source of capital.
Yeah, I mean, it totally transformed operations. And so it went from a very small operation of publishing a monthly journal to a full-fledged foundation that then said, how can we not only continue to ensure the sustainability of Poetry Magazine through this enormous gift, but also what other ways might we expose more audiences, elevate the works of poets beyond what we do on the printed page. And so since then, the foundation has had a really robust set of programs in the communities, actually nationally, partnerships. The website is a primary resource now for educators, for students. There's, thousands, literally thousands of pages of biographies of poets that are accessible, and, a vast resource of poems as well. And in addition, the foundation has its home here in Chicago, and we have a library with tens of thousands of volumes of poetry that are accessible to the public for mining.
The idea around my interest in talking to you is not just to understand the Poetry Foundation and to explore the opportunity that you saw that led you there. It's also to explore how poetry matters as we think about the reimagination of our lives, really. So why don't we start there with the question around how does poetry, if like, a skeptic could say, well, poetry's everywhere. It's poetry, like music is poetry. And a skeptic could say, people write poems independent of a foundation supporting them.
And they do.
And so the correlation, poetry as a artistic genre to the Poetry Foundation, is similar or can be riffed on what other genre to what foundation? Like what role does the foundation play relative to the art or exercise of poetry?
Well, I think even through the programs that we have, and so having, the Poetry Magazine has been around for over 100 years. There's a reason for that. Like there's a real thirst for getting access to poetry of the day, to have someone that is collecting and assembling the works of contemporary poets and making them accessible and available to readers of all sorts. And yeah, you're right. And I don't think it's so much a skeptic, but yeah, you can say poetry is everywhere. And I hope that it is. You can see poetry in a flower. You can see, poetry in a newspaper article. Like it is everywhere. It's song. But our job is to mine all of that to help promote the works of individuals, right? It is done individually, and say, hey, take a look at this. Somebody wrote something really cool here. We read this and found meaning in it. We think you will too. This is somebody that needs to have a broader audience. What can we do to help elevate that work? And so it goes from, the desktop or from your private journal to be shared more broadly so that your beautiful work, your inspiration, your mandate, your charge, all poetry isn't just about flowery, pretty words. Some of it can be, really calling you out, or calling out the work of others. And so it's that kind of cry, that kind of plea, or just a basic expression of
Yeah.
what's real and what's happening, and that has value.
I think that's lovely. And I think that it fills a space that nonfiction and the news does not fill, and that fiction does not fill, and that music does not fill. There's a piercingness to poetry that when it hits, it pierces a lot of resistance, and it opens up a lot of inner beauty, inner joy, inner trauma, inner processing. It almost hits a lane that psychology or therapy also doesn't hit. So there's
Yeah, I think
something
for
so
me, it's like
beautiful
when I
about
read
it.
a poem that connects to me, I feel like, oh my God, this person has managed to put to words what I was feeling, or has managed to express, in a really beautiful way, exactly what I was thinking. Or it helps illuminate for me, something that I might not have known about, in a way that makes it understandable for me to connect to.
What's so compelling is that the foundation celebrates, recognizes, publishes all these things that are fundamentally important to keeping the possibility open for those to then find it. Um, and I'm curious what led you to take this opportunity. What opportunities did you see about how you could affect the Poetry Foundation and its celebration of poetry and poets that led you to take the job to lead the organization?
Well, it was a chance to be connected to a community that, quite frankly, I really didn't have much of a connection to. And, these past 9 months has been, um, life changing for me, in that I've, for someone that's been in the game for, 20 plus years, and to feel like I know everything there is to know about the arts, and I know all the people. And, walking in the door, I got, wow, exposed to this whole new community of creatives that I really had only been connected to at an arm's length. So that was part of it. Two, it was being part of an institution that, has a legacy with the journal, but also is relatively new in terms of a philanthropic organization. 20 years for a foundation is not that long. And so there's a big opportunity here to really have an impact, in a way that had not maybe been done before. And so what can we do, not just to promote our own work, but what can we do to promote the good work of others? Thankfully, we're not the only game in town. There are a lot of people, lots of organizations that are doing really good work, to ensure that poetry is connecting with audiences. And so how can we be in lockstep with these groups? The American Academy of Poets, Cave Canem, Pen America, people that are doing really important, impactful work. What can we do to help strengthen the capacity for, publishers of color, small operations across the country? How can we help elevate the voice of Native American poets and other, populations that don't necessarily get the mainstream platforms that others do? So those are the things that I'm looking, to, and excited about being involved in. The new partnership opportunities, um, help elevating the work that some of these other organizations are involved in, and really being more in partnership and collaboration with folks, on the same shared mission
Yeah.
of expanding the reach of poetry to audiences across the world.
For somebody who writes or believes that they have the capacity to write poetry, who's maybe not sure that their voice matters, what do you say to that person?
That it does. And even if it just matters to you, that's enough. You never know, like, the impact that your words will have on others. And so I just say, keep writing. Write for yourself. I always hear all the time, why do artists paint, or why does a dancer dance? And the answer is always, because I have to. There's not a choice. And so don't be discouraged. Do your thing. And even if you don't get accepted into Poetry Magazine, that doesn't mean anything. There's so many platforms, especially now, in the age of TikTok and other social media platforms, that if it's important for you to get your work out there, you can. But even if it doesn't, keep writing, keep expressing yourself, and make your gifts happen.
When you speak about the diversity of poetry form, and also the goal of full inclusion of every person in our society having a voice that resonates with equal potential, equal possibility. How do you think about someone who says, well, poetry is really too hard to read? How do you speak to somebody who says, how do I consume? I got it that it might matter, or it might be part of answering the question of what's this life about? But how do you talk to the new ways to open your heart to poetry?
Well, I mean, if you don't want to read it, there are podcasts. Everybody's in the podcast. We have podcasts available on our website. There are video poems, people that are, artists that are collaborating with videographers to bring a visual element to their poetry. We have a program that I really love called Hours Poetica, where a poet is actually reading their work. They're little short snippets. Each one is not longer than 2-3 minutes, but it's a great way to get introduced. YouTube is full of that kind of stuff. So there are lots of ways to find your point of entry. I think this year, we had the world got exposed to a really accessible point of entry into poetry, with Amanda Gorman being featured as the inauguration poet. I mean, that did a tremendous amount for reconnecting and introducing poetry to all kinds of new audiences. And so we hope these little moments of intrigue lead to long-lasting and lifelong moments of engagement that make you either a lover of an individual poet's work, or whetting your appetite to learn more about what's out there.
What are some names of some contemporary poets beyond Amanda that you
see? I knew you were going to get me in trouble by saying that. So there are a few that I really like. I love the work of Patricia Smith. She was this year's Pegasus Award winner for her work. She's not necessarily, I don't know, I mean, she's not new, but Rita Dove just published a new collection of poems. And in fact, when, I mentioned earlier about wanting to be a playwright, one of the first plays that I had produced in college was inspired by a poem of hers, If There Be Sorrow. I love, the work of Nate Marshall from Chicago, who does really, I'm reading his book now. It was released last year, Fitna, and I'm having a really good time with that. But there's so many. So I don't want to get into too much trouble. So, yeah, there are lots, so many. I can't even name them all. How about that?
When I took poetry, my first beyond high, when I went to Michigan, and I took a poetry class, and the professor was one of the editors of the Norton Anthology of Poetry, and it was thrilling, really, to feel like you were alongside this person who was, Norton Anthology at the time was like the definitive publisher that compiled like the 1,000 most important poems, right? And he would talk about how they chose one over the other. And I remember this question that I tried to ask, I'm not sure I got it answered sufficiently, which was, what role does format have in poems? So Shakespeare had the iambic pentameter, and there's the rhyming of poems, but then there's the not rhyming of poems, and then there's the fragments, and then there's the full sentences. How do you think about the form of poems, and what role the right or wrong or format in general might speak to a poem being good, bad, or indifferent?
Well, I think that's what's so cool about poetry, right? That there is no right or wrong. It's really up to the writer to determine their form. And it's constantly evolving and changing. I think people will find their voice or their sweet spot with particular styles. But that's what I love about poetry. I mean, it's like saying, what's a right or wrong form for music? There are a lot. You can be rock, you can be jazz, you can be pop, you can be classical. You find you find your groove, and I think that's what poets do. And sometimes they might flow in between lots of different kinds of grooves, whether it's a sonnet, iambic pentameter, rhyming or not spoken. I love the flexibility and the range.
Is there something beyond slam poetry, which would you say slam poetry is new? How would you describe the innovation of slam poetry?
Well, I think it's just another way of getting at the work. It's performance.
Great. So performance.
It's performance.
So just like you could almost draw these lines that could be next to each other of, in the world of painting, from figurative to abstract, to then along comes Duchamp and says, why wouldn't a urinal be art? Anything is art. And all of a sudden art becomes anything. And in the right context, it allows you to see everything with a different perspective visually. If that's sort of part of the story of the evolution of what is art, is there something about what is poetry recently that you think is like, just to share with us what you now know from the seat of running the Poetry Foundation or overseeing it, what's new in the form factor of poetry?
Well, I guess I could say what I know is that I don't know. That, when you were making the example about Duchamp, right? And, the classic line of somebody in the museum saying, oh, I could have did that. That was just somebody throwing a paintbrush on the canvas. Yeah, well, you didn't. And so it's the same thing about poetry. Somebody might read something really simple and says, oh, I could have wrote that. Well, you didn't. Somebody else did. Somebody else took the time, and it probably took them a long time to really do that really simple piece. So what I know is, for me, as someone that's new to the foundation, that every day is a new day for me. Every day I get introduced to a new different style. I love that every day I get to read a new poet, at least, 10 new poets I'm reading a day, and each one will be very different from the other. So it's a cool little gift, to present to myself every day. We have a poem of the day that I look forward to getting, in my email box, because it's going to be either somebody contemporary or new, or an old poet. We might even have somebody featured, might be Emily Dickinson. But whoever it is, it's a new experience for me. And so for those few minutes of that day, of each day, I can take a break and enter into this world.
That's lovely. And what I think I've come to know about poetry is it does require some intention, just like meditation does. And it's always worth it. And what's interesting to me is, how do you open up that lens? How do you open up that lens for yourself, for people around you? I have one high profile friend who, the way she disciplined her kids when they were growing up is that if they got punished, they had to memorize a poem before they can get out of the punishment. And I thought that was brilliant. Poems as punishment is not the point. I think the idea, like, there's something about, if you're gonna go take the liberty over there, part of what I care about is you putting some intention into acts. And so the insertion of poetry, I think, is limitless to where it can go. I thought that was sort of clever.
Yeah, I think, we try to make poetry, this kind of big, heavy thing. And for many of us, it was the way we learned to speak. It was the way we learned to process language. Probably the first thing you learned was "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder where you are." You know, you learn to read with Dr. Seuss, all rhymes. You know, those it's poetry. And so it's how do you start from something at a very simple level? And yes, it can progress and be complex, but also people shouldn't be afraid and think that poetry has to stay at this very, you know, complex level, that you can still find your point of entry with the simple passage, with the simple poem, simplicity of it. Um, and if you find that you are presented with a work that you don't understand or that you're not interested in, turn the page, because there'll be another one and another one and another one that might then connect with you.
It's the frame of this conversation of the series that we're doing in Chicago Ideas is life's big questions. What's so interesting is that you're speaking to an idea of these are the little questions that might add up. It's how to get into the little, the day-to-day questions, and poetry could show up for you. The other thing you said that I find so resonant is the skepticism with which people often walk through an art museum with the idea of, I could have done that, or I could do that, or why is it so famous, or why is it worth so much? I could do it. And similarly, might read a poem and say it's so simple, or it's so easy, or I could have written it. But the fact is they didn't.
They didn't.
And
if you think you could, then do it.
That's
don't
that's
stop.
the ultimate punchline. Is the big question here is what is either getting in the way of, or what is possible for a person in terms of asking questions, exploring answers, and doing it through poetry. I want to, I know we've got limited time, and so I want to end with the lightning round that we've done now for 10 years straight with every person who's joined us on the Chicago Ideas stage, either physical or virtual. I want to ask you some quick questions so we can get to know Michelle Boone a little better. What's your favorite book that you think, whether everyone should read it, or a book that if somebody says, what must I read? What's the answer?
Can I say two?
Sure.
Man on the Promised Land by Claude Brown, and then A Prayer for Owen Meany by John Irving. Those are my two favorite books. Very different from each other.
I've read one of the two, and wow, great. One person, dead or alive, that you would love to have dinner with?
James Baldwin.
What's your favorite flavor of ice cream?
Ooh, butter pecan.
Favorite city other than Chicago to visit?
Paris.
Favorite TV show?
The Simpsons.
Wow, I haven't heard that one. I love that. There's poetry in The Simpsons, that's for sure. There's a lot of lessons in The Simpsons.
I know. I see The Simpsons every day.
Really?
I do. I mean, well, you know what? It's like, well, first of all, I love it. It's hilarious. It's so well written, and it's on every day. And so I find that, like, you know, after working all day, when I come home, you know, I grew up in a big family, and so like noise in the household is kind of like quiet for me. And so I always had the TV on, and you can always find The Simpsons on. And so it's like kind of that background noise that, like, I know all the jokes, I know what's happening. And it's just very comforting to me.
Yeah, it's like Simpsons, either Simpsons as therapy or Simpsons as poetic frame of space and thought. That's cool. And the last question, if you could put a billboard, the biggest billboard on 94, people driving into and out of Chicago would always see this billboard, and you had to put one quote on it, what would it say?
Ooh. Be kind. I think we let's get back to kindness. Yeah, be kind, be kind. Try harder, be kind.
I love that. Michelle Boone, you are a kind human being. You've shown
Oh,
up in my life and in the lives of the Chicago Ideas community as someone who demonstrates kindness, who acts with love and care, and who really is passionate about our culture, engagement, inclusion, and so much more. So I want to thank you, Michelle Boone, for joining us on the Chicago Ideas virtual stage. And I also want to not just congratulate you, but offer you the collective good karma of all of us, because the opportunity that you have at the Poetry Foundation is remarkable in what you are going to be able, have been able to, but now have in front of you in terms of the impact you're going to be able to make. So Michelle Boone, thank you so much for joining us.
thank you, Brad. And I'll just say, I really appreciate all of what you just said. And I'm only able to do it because there's a terrific, hardworking, dedicated team of people here at the foundation who I learn from every day and who also share that same commitment and passion of elevating poetry, elevating the work of good poets that are out there, and connecting with those that are also committed to doing the same work. So thank you. Happy to be here, and all the best. Stay safe and healthy in 2022.
Michelle Boone, thank you so much. Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Brad.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.